Our next speaker is Tina Fearing. She says you can also pronounce it firing. And her topic is a surprising problem for optimism about philosophical progress.
All right. First, just thanks for the invitation. Seems like it's going to be it's already a good conference, so I'm very happy to be here. So how close to the microphone do I need to stand? Is this fine? Okay. So some of you will see that I've changed my title. The previous title, How to be an Optimist About Philosophical Progress, was a bit too much to live up to, especially for a 40-minute talk, including Q&A. So I'm going to talk about a surprising problem for optimism about philosophical progress. So I'm just going to start by saying something about this debate. As been mentioned already, it's sort of a hot debate these days. It's not an entirely new debate, but recently there's been a lot of discussion about philosophical progress, and the main question has sort of been, has philosophy made enough progress so far? And then, roughly speaking, you can sort of divide the contribution to the debate into two camps. So you have pessimism and optimism. Some philosophers say that and scientists and others say that there's no progress in philosophy whatsoever. And then we have other more extreme views. So Herman Kaplan has argued that philosophy has solved, or in a sense, we've solved all the big problems of philosophy. So sort of an extremely optimistic position. David Chalmers is arguing that philosophy has made some progress, but not as much as we would like, where he sort of wants us to make as much as the hard sciences. And then you have Daniel Stoljar, who's written this book about optimism about philosophical progress, where he's defending what he calls a reasonable optimism, according to which we have solved many of the big problems of philosophy, but there's still many problems left for us to solve. So that's sort of the starting point. And if you're not familiar with this debate, you're probably going to have some questions about this sort of way of dividing the debate, especially how much progress is enough progress. But for my purposes in this presentation, the thing I want to note now is that all these views are, with some exceptions, views about what philosophy has accomplished so far. So it's a debate about the historical record, primarily. And I thought that was a bit strange. Why are we having this backwards-looking debate? Isn't the interesting question whether we're making progress right now, how much progress we're going to make in the future? And surprisingly, at least to me, almost none of the philosophers writing on this topic have, at least in print, a view about how much progress we will make in the future. And there's a couple of reasons why that might be so. When we start to do philosophy, it's sort of part of our training. We're sort of trained to look back. We're asked to read all these great philosophers. Thinking about the future is quite hard, so maybe that's one of the reasons why we haven't been thinking about future progress. But I think that one main reason why we're not talking about future progress is that a lot of people writing about philosophical progress assume this principle that I've called the uniformity of philosophy, or UP for short. So philosophy's future will, in ways relevant to progress, be roughly like philosophy's past. So I'm not going to back this up now, but if you look at the progress debate, you can see a lot of philosophers moving from has statements to is statements. And it's also sort of something of a bit of a scandal, I think, if philosophers are not accepting this UP principle, because that means that philosophers are not talking about the future at all, which I think is like slightly irresponsible even. We should be sort of able to say something about what we're doing right now, what's the value of our work, and if we're not making any progress, it's not entirely clear why we should be paid to do philosophical research. So I think the charitable interpretation is that philosophers are actually assuming, perhaps implicitly, something like UP. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if someone wants to push back, but that's sort of my main hypothesis there. I'm going to give you a few examples. This talk is about optimism about philosophical progress. I'm going to show you a few examples of optimists explicitly making, or they have to assume UP. So here is Daniel Stoljar. So we should suppose that reasonably many problems have been solved, and in consequence, we should expect reasonably many to be solved in the future. And then the only other explicit view of future progress I could find is Stuart Brock. So he's saying that I believe philosophy has made outstanding progress. And if I'm right, we have every reason to be proud of philosophy's past achievements and confident that philosophy's future will be very bright indeed. So this is what I'm going to challenge in this presentation. Surprisingly, I don't think all optimists can make what I've called UP. So the surprising problem for optimism about philosophical progress is that it seems like you may not be able to be an optimist and also think that philosophy's future will, in ways relevant to progress, be roughly like philosophy's past. And I'm going to show you why that is so. Okay, first I'm going to say something about optimism. So I'm not going to say an awful lot about this. I'm just going to say that. So what all the optimists have in common is that they believe that relative to some benchmark, philosophy has made enough progress in the past. But they disagree about what progress is and how much progress is enough for progress. So one example is Helen here has a view about philosophical progress. She's an optimist, but she's not a big fan of other optimistic positions, as far as I can tell. So if you put 5 optimists in the same room, no one would probably agree with Helen's optimism, and maybe people wouldn't agree either with Daniel Stoljar's optimism or Herman Koplin's optimism. So there's just a lot of variation, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to go with what's sort of the dominant view, or it has been the dominant view in the debate about philosophical progress, which is that to make progress in philosophy is to solve philosophical problems. And I'm just adopting that framework because that's how the optimists are talking, like the optimists I'm going to focus on. But things will probably look very different if you assume a different account of philosophical progress. So I think just keep in mind that this is a short presentation and it's just going to apply to problem-solving accounts. Okay. So to talk about optimism about the past and optimism about the future, I'm going to use the labels P-optimism and F-optimism. And it's just going to mean philosophy has made enough progress in the past or philosophy will make enough progress in the future. And then the argument I'm going to focus on is this. So the first premise is P-optimism, the second premise is UP, and then the conclusion is F-optimism. Okay, so what's wrong with the argument? So perhaps there's nothing wrong with the argument. Perhaps you can have it all. But I'm going to argue that once you endorse P1, it's going to be really hard for you to also endorse P2. So the claim I'm making is that P-optimism is a threat to UP. Okay, so I'm going to give you 2 reasons to think so. The first one is a bit extreme. So it's called The Worry That Philosophy is Super Wonderful. It's a label I've borrowed from Herman Kaplan. So when I was a student in Oslo, Herman pre-circulated a book that he was working on called A Defense of Philosophy, or Why Philosophy is Super Wonderful. And apparently he's picking up that book again. So that's perhaps with a new title, who knows. So he's working on the issue of defending philosophy, or arguing that philosophy is super wonderful. And the worry, so here's Kaplan's view. So he thinks that we have collective knowledge of the answers to all the big problems of philosophy. If you pair that with the dominant view of progress, according to which progress is a matter of collectively answering big questions, you have something like a radical P-optimism, or the view that philosophy is super wonderful. And this kind of view is also sometimes attributed to early Wittgenstein and to David Lewis. I'm not going to make that case. It's up for grabs whether that's reasonable or not. But it's not a very popular view, so you can count on one hand, basically, how many people think that philosophy is super wonderful or that radical P-optimism is true. But what should be clear is that if this kind of radical P-optimism is true, then UP must be false. Philosophy's future will not be roughly like philosophy's past in ways relevant to progress, because there wouldn't be unsolved philosophical problems for us to solve. So you can't be a radical P-optimist and also use UP in your argument for F-optimism. Okay. And then the obvious reply is that, well, radical P-optimism is false. I don't think I really have to explain why, and I think others feel the same. So here's Daniel Stolzer. He's basically saying that if this is your view on philosophical progress, then it's just inconsistent with like how we think about the world and our place in it. It's just like too implausible. And there's also other arguments you could give. You can point at disagreement. And a lot of people believe that some sort of agreement between experts is required for collective knowledge. And it's just like philosophy might be wonderful, but it's not super wonderful in the way just outlined. What's probably true instead, the optimists say, is that something like the following might be a better picture, where we just solved more problems, but there's still a lot of problems left for us to solve. And so if you sort of, for simplicity, say that there's only 100 philosophical problems, and then we solve one problem every 50 years, and we've been doing this for about 2,000 years, then it seems like we have at least 3,000 years of more progress to look forward to. So perhaps at some point we should start to worry that we might not make enough progress in the future. But it seems like we should just relax and think that, well, there might be a difference here, but it's not going to matter for how much progress we make. So the more modest optimists should, or in my experience, are sort of like, oh, this problem does not apply to me. I can have both F-optimism and UP. I don't think so. So here's the second worry, which is a more concerning worry. So not all philosophical problems are equal. Some are more difficult than others. And the low-hanging fruit worry is that the progress we made so far was easier to make than the progress, or the problems we've solved so far are easier than the problems we haven't solved. And why should we think that? Well, one reason to think so is like some problems have been around for a long time. So we can sort of look at how much time the philosophical community have been spending on trying to solve problems. So if you take Thales' question, is everything water? And then you compare that sort of the time spent trying to solve that problem and compare it to the hard problem of consciousness, where there's just a lot of people trying to solve this problem for a long time. It just seems like uncontroversial that some problems are just more difficult, and then it's an empirical claim, of course, whether our situation is like that, whether there are more problems around now that are more difficult for us to make progress on. So I'm not going to make the case, I'm just sort of, if you think that's the case, then you should be a bit worried about optimism or making progress in the future. We can make it worse. We can say that some problems are probably unsolvable. And if you're an optimist and you sort of want to argue that we will make enough progress also in the future, you might at least want to sort of interact with the sort of arguments in the literature for the claim that some philosophical problems are unsolvable. So it seems like we do have a relevant difference here. So the problems we haven't yet solved are on average harder than the problems we have solved in the past. Okay, so the surprising problem for optimism about philosophical progress is not clear that P2 can be true if P1 is true. And this surprising problem is not very difficult. I think there are ways around that problem. And I'm just going to look at a few of those possible replies. So one type of reply, I could just call it the fruit garden reply. So making philosophical progress does not get harder and harder the more progress we make. I'm going to show you two examples or two ways to think, two reasons to think that might be so. And then there's something I call will do better replies. So making philosophical progress does get harder and harder the more progress we make. However, philosophers and their circumstances also improve over time. And so there's no tension between P-optimism and UP. So that's sort of the two kinds of replies. So the very large fruit garden reply. So some philosophers have said, or they believe, that we are sort of just getting started. So sure, we've been picking some low-hanging fruit, but it's not the case that what remains in philosophy is just a higher hanging fruit. There's just like the philosophy is so big that we can keep picking low-hanging fruits for a very long time. So not a problem. The other reply, the expanding fruit garden reply. So new philosophical problems enter the discipline as a result of progress being made in science, progress being made in philosophy, when the world changes. So new philosophical problems, climate change, for instance. Ethics of AI wasn't really a topic a while back. And new people doing philosophy is also going to lead to new philosophical problems being discovered by us. So that's one possible reply. And then moving to the will do better replies. So if philosophers have, historically speaking, outperformed their predecessors by developing and implementing new methods, then we should sort of expect to do that also in the future, at least if we assume UP to be true. Some people say that we can make more progress in philosophy by just doing a bit better. So we take the methods we already have and then we apply them more carefully, and we could also do better by doing better as a group. So instead of us all sitting in our own armchairs doing better on our own, we can sort of talk together, we can sort of figure out what's the optimal way of doing philosophy and then make more progress and thus solve problems that were too difficult before. So here's, I asked ChatGPT to make a picture of Timothy Williamson under a fruit tree, and this is what I got. Okay. The progress promotion reply. So Newton famously say, if I have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. It seems like we can make more progress in philosophy by doing just that. Again, progress is being made in other disciplines. Perhaps there's progress in, or the optimist will be committed to saying that there is progress in philosophy. So if that progress sort of becomes publicly available, then we can use that progress and perhaps we can solve problems that were too difficult in the past. Other possible will do better applies. So we're a lot more people doing philosophy now. And it seems like that it would be surprising if we weren't able to do better by just being more people. And there's also a lot of new perspectives in philosophy, and that might also be a reason to be optimistic that we will sort of be able to solve problems that were too difficult to solve in the past. So with the will do better applies, of course, it sort of have to cancel each other out. So philosophical problems are more difficult, but we're also improving. So it's not the case that philosophy's future will be different from philosophy's past in a way that is relevant to progress. So that's sort of the empirical claim you have to back up if you want to do this will do better apply. Okay, so can p-optimist endorse UP? That depends on three things. So how optimistic your p-optimism is, what there is left to achieve in philosophy, the extent to which philosophers and their circumstances improve over time. That's sort of three important factors. But of course, like p-optimists that want to be f-optimists can just deny UP. There's many ways to be an optimist about philosophical progress. But I think this sort of, the fact that it's not, that UP is sort of up for grabs, so is optimism, it sort of, at least is a problem that optimists should want to address, especially when you sort of assume that once you're an optimist about philosophical progress, that sort of rolls over. You can also be optimistic about the future, but perhaps optimism about philosophical progress at some point should make you be a pessimist. Good news is that pessimists are also welcome to become optimists. So if UP is false, then there's really 4 positions in the debate about philosophical progress, not just the 2 from the first slide. So we should sort of figure out, we should talk more about UP and the future. I think I'm going to stop there.
All right.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I thought I had like objections to your argument, but now I'm not really sure whether you're making the claim that we should not be optimistic because the optimist argument is flawed or not. So I'll just assume that you are making the claim that we should not be optimistic because that argument is flawed, okay? I couldn't really see the reason why if you hold on to the first premise, then you have to give up the second or the other way around, because it seems to me that there are ways in which you can qualify both of those premises in a way that they can't be attacked. And I want to say that I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. So assuming I'm an optimist, then I can guard my position from your objection. So regarding the first premise, yes, as you said in the replies, indeed, the set of problems need not be fixed. So it depends on what the domain is over which that quantifiers all of the big problems ranges. It seems to me that as we move on, new problems become relevant to us. It's not really that the big problems are always the same. Big problems of the past are not the big problems of today because they are not relevant to us anymore. And yes, again, so as your second reply says, we get better, but that is not just a hope, it's also something that we did observe in the track record of philosophy. So Zeno's paradox was a big problem, then it was not a big problem because we got better with time. So that doesn't mean that there are no more big problems, but we can have a reasonable inductive hope that we will get better at solving those that appear as big problems to us. You also made a side remark that some problems may be unsolvable. Okay, I'm not quite sure what to make of it. It could be that discovering that some problems are unsolvable is itself a sign of progress, or it could be that those unsolvable problems really are, as other people would say, pseudo problems. So they don't even need solving. I don't know what is in that category. So I don't know whether you do want to say that this optimism is unmotivated or unjustified or not, but this is at least my take on what one could respond if one were an optimist.
Yeah. So I don't think that the optimist is in big trouble here. I just think that on the face of it, or I think that optimists haven't thought about this. They just state their view about the future, or they just assume that we will continue to do well in the future. And I think that's completely fine as long as you sort of add some additional commitments to your optimism. So as you said, you sort of have to, it depends on the optimism. So you have to sort of spell out what exactly you have in mind. And then you sort of, if you do think that, like, as you said, I think your view is very similar to that of Daniel Stoljar, which is that the big problems we're working on now are just different ones, and we keep running into new problems, then that's fine. That's sort of your solution to this problem. But I think for some other optimists, like Herman Kaplan, this is going to be a bigger problem. And if you do think that the number of problems in philosophy is fixed, then you have a bigger problem. So it's going to be a problem for some optimists, but not for all optimists. It's just something you sort of have to work around.
Next is Professor Schurz. There's your box. Please take the box.
Thank you.
And then.
Thank you for your talk. I think what is a bit lacking also in the other talks is a definition of progress in philosophy and how that is connected with consensus or increasing consensus. Because in philosophy, the diversity of methodological paradigms and of paradigmatic assumptions is much bigger than in other scientific fields, right? And if I think about particular subfields of, say, analytic philosophy, say the theories of truth-likeness, clearly there has been progress. I mean, we know now much more about different possible approaches and what the consequences are. Or theories of Bayesian philosophy of formal epistemology, or I don't know, I mean, theories of commensurability or incommensurability between theories or so on. But I mean, there are other fields in groups of philosophers sense who just ignore these developments. I mean, you know, so there is no general progress in the sense that their consensus is increasing. I mean, there is still disagreement about, say, is scientific realism or instrumentalism true, right? I mean, people are discussing that now in analytic philosophy of science since I don't know when, since 1950s or 60s, and the diversity is as big as it was before. So, I mean, in which sense do you discuss this problem? Do you mean when you discuss it? Progress in particular fields, or do you mean progress in philosophy in general?
There's just a very large and fast-growing literature on this. Like the role of agreement in that literature is like it's discussed by many people, like whether progress requires agreement or not. And so you think I should have said something? So I'm sort of in this. I'm just trying to make a very tiny point, which is to sort of point at this new problem. And I think like once we sort of think more about what progress is, then this problem is going to look very different from account to account. But I'm not going to commit myself to a view of what progress is, whether it requires agreement or anything for this smaller paper, because I think that's sort of just like trying to like deal with the entire debate all at once is sort of the main question, or one of the main questions in this recent debate is like the role of disagreement and whether we can make progress in philosophy when there's so much disagreement. So I think that's just like a bigger topic. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. But that's sort of like, for my purposes, I agree. Perhaps I should be clearer that this is like the next step, sort of, in this discussion. Like, I've just focused on the problem-solving account, and I think that if you think that progress is a matter of solving big philosophical problems, then you sort of have to deal with this uniformity of philosophy argument for future optimism. So that's the only claim I'm making for this paper.
All right, then Jani.
Okay, thanks for this super clear talk. I think I'm an optimist about the past and the present, and I'm tempted to assume UP, but I have a further worry about the UP, and that connects to the material conditions of doing philosophy. And I don't want to sound too alarmistic, but it seems to me that there is a realistic risk that in a few decades, because of all the ecological crises, the kind of material conditions of doing philosophy will not perhaps collapse, but get so worse that would kind of be a major, at least, hindrance to the philosophical progress. Something like what happened when the kind of western part of the Roman Empire collapsed or declined. Clearly, at least in a kind of a broader Mediterranean area, there was a major hindrance to the philosophical progress as well, and perhaps also kind of scientific. Something like that might happen because of the ecological crisis, and that might be actually one reason not just to assume UP.
Yeah, so things might also get worse, and that's also an argument against UP. So yeah, I think that's also something to consider. But again, I think maybe things are going in the other direction, so maybe we disagree about that. It seems like things are getting a lot better in philosophy, especially if you think about the amount of people doing it and the sort of tools we have available. So I mean, it's about the future, so it's hard to predict, but it seems like it's a problem for UP either way.
Yeah.
So.
All right, and then Jouni Matti.
Yeah, thank you. This is super interesting. It's intuitive to me that our practices get better, like
regarding truth likeness, something like that. But I'm curious about the optimists. What are the problems that have been solved? I mean, is there a list of problems that have been actually solved? And then what's the definition of them having been solved? When has it been solved? It's just that goes off to the sciences, or we stop talking about them, or is it really definitively something that now we know the answer?
So I don't have a short answer to that question. As I said, different optimists have different. So once you assume this problem-solving account, it doesn't mean that you're going to agree with other people with the problem-solving account, precisely because what it takes to solve a philosophical problem is going to be different on different accounts. So I'm not going to give examples of solved problems. I think that's just going to be a bit provocative, and it sort of requires more time. But you can look up Daniel Stoljar and Herman Kaplan, and at some point Helen Beebe's new book.
Okay. Next is Uzi. Before I ask you a little question myself, so what do you think? Which general attitude fosters progress more efficiently? The attitude that sure, everything's going on fine, or the critical attitude that no, we must do something to make more progress?
Well, I haven't thought about that, but it seems like it depends on how well we're doing. So if we're doing really well, then we should just keep going. But if we can do better, so I think especially if you're slightly pessimistic, you think that there's more potential, then you might sort of find new ways to make more progress. So perhaps a tiny bit of pessimism is helpful. But again, it's going to depend on what our situation is.
All right, and then Uzi.
Hey, thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it. Stoljar is one of my favorite philosophers. And I guess if you do want one good example of philosophical progress, I have an analytic philosopher friend who says that really in the last 30 years or so, the only clear example of the philosophical progress they can think about is the Gettier problem. I wonder what you think.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that Gettier did something good, but this debate is sort of about whether we made enough progress. So I think both optimists and pessimists will say, yeah, there was progress made by Gettier, but then perhaps it's a bit disappointing. We only know what knowledge is not.
Yeah, it's very rare to have these cases where you actually have agreement.
Yeah, so it's just gonna depend on ask different optimists. They're gonna have different expectations, and for some people, this sort of negative progress, finding out what knowledge is not, is going to be perhaps what pushes you to say that we made enough progress in philosophy. Perhaps someone will be disappointed. So it's just lots of disagreement about that. I don't really have a view. I think it's a really complicated question, like whether we made enough progress. But yeah, Gettier did something good.
Okay, so thanks very much.